Hello everyone, it's time for another Books I've Read in 2023, Part 1 for the first half of the year. Starting off the year with a nonfiction called The Disappearing Spoon by Sam Kean. This is a book about the periodic table of elements, but it's written like an adventure novel. It's epic and full of events and stories that propel you forward, and it's really fun and really entertaining. And the author basically takes you on a tour of the table of elements as they were discovered and what their uses are and how we use them today and how they were used historically and so on and so forth. I think it's written in a way that's really approachable even if you don't have much of a chemistry background. So really fun. I'm glad I read it. I was super inspired. There were parts of it that didn't resonate quite as much with me, but for the most part, I really enjoyed this book, and I would recommend. Then I discovered a new mystery series. This is the Akitada mystery series. Akitada is the detective, and it's set in 11th century Japan, which is really fun, and it definitely felt a lot more like a fantasy. This is the third one in the series. It's called The Hell Screen. I had no idea at the time. I just found it at a used bookstore. It looked interesting and I decided to read it. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the character dynamics and relationships and just the setting, of course. Then I read the this is actually the first one in the series because I kind of went out of order, called The Dragon Scroll. And I didn't enjoy this one as much, although I still enjoyed it because it gave me an opportunity to be introduced to some of the characters I had already read about in the Hell Screen. However, structurally it's very similar. There's a very clear and obvious pattern to how these books are written, which it is what it is. And I think, there's a story, there's the climax and the, leading up to the climax and the resolution. There's always a formula to stories, but I think some authors are more adept at hiding the formula, whereas this one felt a little bit more obvious. I actually started reading the second book in the series, which was Rashomon Gate, but I never finished because it felt too much like the other two in the series. And so I think it's a series I will go back to just because I do like the characters, and over the course of the series there is a lot of character growth and development and relationship development, which I think is really cool. And again, 11th century Japan is super fun to have as a setting, but I don't think I could read them back to back to back because they're too similar. Then I went back to Trusty Rusty, Agatha Christie, who is always one of my favorites. This is a book that I had never read before, and I always think that I've read them all, but there's so many. And I was talking with a friend who had just finished this book and really loved it and highly recommended it, and I was like, oh my gosh, an Agatha Christie book I had never heard of. And so I read this one, and oh my goodness, it's great. And I think it is probably up there with my all-time Agatha favorites. The Man in the Brown Suit. Just a really fun story. And there was some romance, which was nice. Then we have The Science of Murder, which is a nonfiction that is all about the forensic science of Agatha Christie, which when I was interested in reading this book because, again, I'm a really big Agatha Christie fan, but I was a little bit skeptical because it's like, all right, we're still basing science or trying to apply science to stories, to fiction, and I don't know, it feels like a bit of a stretch. But after reading this book, it ended up being really fun, and I have like a whole new perspective on Agatha Christie books, which I really appreciate because these are books that I keep going back to. I've reread Agatha Christie books over and over throughout my life. I've also watched and rewatched Poirot and Miss Marple, and I've also re-listened to the radio plays over and over and over. So some of these stories I've revisited feels like 100 times, but that's probably an exaggeration. So now I have a new perspective that I can go to listen or read or watch an Agatha Christie, and that I appreciate. Then I read The Magpie Murders. And this was a really fascinating book, and I really enjoyed it, and it really took me by surprise. There is 2 stories playing out, and the way the author kind of intertwined them, at first I was a little confused, and I was like, did I somehow start reading a different book completely? What's going on? I couldn't quite understand it, and I was also always a little bit like, is this a true account? Or is this part of the fiction? And that was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I will say I did maybe slightly enjoy the more tropey story within the story, because it had a very Agatha Christie vibe. But I can't say anything more about that. But anyways, it was really fun, and I definitely want to read more from this author, Anthony Horowitz. Then I finally got to The Retreat by Sarah Pearse, which is a book that I had pre-ordered, I think last year, after reading her first book in this series called The Sanatorium, which I really enjoyed. I mean, it wasn't, to be honest, it's kind of a forgettable book for me. It's not one that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is one of the best books ever, you gotta go read it. It was entertaining enough, and the setting was exciting. It was in an old sanatorium. And then, so I was like, you know what, I enjoyed it enough that I'm gonna pre-order this book, and so it's been on my shelf for a while. Finally read it. And it was really frustrating. So one of the things that I felt in the first book, The Sanatorium, is the main character kind of frustrated me a little bit. I felt like she was constantly taking like a half step forward and then 10 steps backwards. And her inner dialogue was just like, communicate, just get over it and do it. And of course, like in the story, she grows and learns and evolves. And so by the end of it, you feel like, oh, maybe she has taken a couple steps forward now and has evolved as a person. But then this book starts like all the way back to square one, I felt like. And the character was just as she had started in the last book, which was really frustrating because it felt backwards. And as a character that I already felt was a little bit frustrating, I was particularly frustrated because it was like starting all over again. And I hate being critical because it was still entertaining, and to be able to write a book, 1, is amazing, and to be able to have it published, 2, is extraordinary. So I have a lot of respect for anybody that can write anything and then have it published. But it was so similar to the first book in the series. Remember how I was talking about that pattern? And some authors are really good at making it very subtle. You don't even think about it. This one was very much, it felt like there was an equation, and this story was just input into the same equation that the sanatorium was input into, and it just kind of bummed me out because I don't like recognizing that. I don't like when it feels too much like you're just reading a story that feels unoriginal, I think. So anyways, but it was entertaining enough, and so it's gonna get bad because now I have another book to criticize. This is a book called The River that a pen pal actually sent me, and for the first 2/3 of the book I found it really exciting and engaging. Maybe it was more like halfway through the book that it felt that way, and I was like, oh, this is a book that I could easily read in a day, lose sleep, just read all through the night until I finish it, because it was just like one of those, it grabs you by the hand and it runs and you're just on an adventure instantly. But then little events, or rather big events, kept happening that just felt like they were thrown into the pot to make it even more exciting. Like the soup was already spicy enough, and then they added in another batch of peppers and another batch of some other kind of peppers, and started to feel like, okay, this is just drama and excitement for the sake of it. And it didn't feel real, and it didn't feel authentic, and I felt duped. I felt tricked. And then the way it ended, it was a very and we're done. There was really, it felt really rushed and really like an afterthought. Like it was never planned. It just oh, we better wrap this up now. We've thrown in all these really exciting events and we should finish it now. And so just boom, done. And I felt so tricked and what's the word? Manipulated as a reader, and I was really very frustrated. But now I have some great news, because I then read one of the best character books I've ever read, and that is a book that was highly recommended by so many people over and over and over again, called The Thursday Murder Club, and I'm really grateful that I finally read it, because let me tell you, the characters in this story, they are so endearing, so tenderly written. I want to hug them, I want to talk with them, I want to cry with them, I want to laugh with them. I'm getting emotional just thinking about how relatable and charming and endearing and tender these characters were, and I loved every single one of them. They were all so fantastic and perfectly written. Each one had a really strong voice that it was just instantly, within the first sentence, you knew exactly who was talking, which character was talking, and it didn't feel forced, it didn't feel contrived. It was so natural and so, I don't know, tender is the word that keeps coming up. The way the author approached the characters was tender. The way the author wrote about these characters was tender. It was just, there was such a grace. Beautifully written. I was just so impressed with how these characters were written, and I feel like I'm gushing a whole heck of a lot, but I just really loved it. I loved the story. I really felt like I was in the room with these characters, and I really felt like I got to know them, and they feel very real to me. I also just really quickly wanted to add that this book is a story of hope. I didn't expect this book to feel so hopeful. So I'm very excited to read the second book, but also a little bit apprehensive, because I'm worried that I'll be disappointed. But so far the feedback is people have enjoyed the second book just as much, if not more, as the first book. So one of these days I'll work up the courage and I'll read the second book in this series. So that is it. That is Books Read in 2023 Part 1. Thank you all for watching. I'd love to know if any of these books are ones that you've read yourself or want to read, or if you have any books that you read this year that you just will remember for life. Bye.